we have the returning mind of information. Literally, I showed last time the size of his even one volume of his book compared to my book just makes mine look like an introduction, a prelude. He has a mind of information from ancient history, from basically all things Bible, but how it ties together through ancient religions, ideologies, worldviews, plus secret societies, everything. So, without further ado, I am going to ask you all to welcome our guest, the returning Gary Wayne. Hi, Gary.
Well, good evening, and thank you for inviting me back. So happy to be here, and looking forward to another interesting discussion. And as I recall, this is our second interview. I think we did the other one back in December or late December. So
Yeah,
for people who want to, may want to reference back because we don't try to go over the same territory when we do
yeah.
shows, that one will be loaded with information as well. And so sometimes, when people talk about my mind, I also sort of mention, just sort of tongue in cheek, that at the last letter there is D, but you might sometimes put an E there because it's like a mine, not a mine that you're going to take stuff out of, but makes your other people's head explode when I start
Yeah.
talking about things.
I think as well, because you spent so many years studying
Yeah,
things that certainly in Christianity was pushed to the side.
yeah,
Nobody wanted to look at another world religion. Nobody wanted to look at ideologies from the different sectors of ancient history, and nobody
yeah,
wanted to piece the sort of forgotten bits of history together.
yeah.
And I know, like I've read volume one a few times. I've read volume two now a few times, but you have a fictional work that is
Yeah.
releasing. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that to get us started.
Yeah, so the new book is called The Primo Conspiracy, and subtitle is AI's Covenant with Babylon. And so what this book is trying to do is sort of bring a lot of my research, whether or not it is in prehistory and bloodlines and how this world works, together with my research on end time prophecy, and build a narrative around there and take it a little bit more mainstream. And that's why it's a novel versus, a nonfiction book that I generally write, which I am working on my third book as well on that as well. And this is a book that the co-author, Bill Carmichael, who is the publisher of Deep River Publishing, who publishes my books, he does the sort of fiction part. So it's a blending of how do we create a narrative that's interesting but gets important concepts out to people, that is both kind of historically reliable, what's going on today is reliable, and that we can go to the Bible and pull up everything that we're talking about. And so it the first book is sort of setting up how the last 7 years are going to come about. And so that takes a lot of setting the table, because everybody has a different view of where we are in terms of the prophetic timeline.
Mhm.
And you want to get the major parts of the geopolitical, religious, catastrophic sort of things all on the table, but you're also trying to develop characters, right? And you're
Yeah,
trying to
yeah,
set down a premise. So it's focusing also with a major focus, on what Bill wanted to focus on was is how do we introduce AI as a more important aspect of the end time, but not sort of overreach with it.
yeah, yeah,
Because I mean, we can make a lot of biblical connections, and we want to sort of say this is going to be something that's kind of important. So we get to the third seal in book one and the introduction of the fourth seal, and
hmm,
things are really starting to pick up. But we've introduced all of the things that you're kind of talking about, is how is this connected to prehistory, because nothing is new under the sun, what was will be again,
yeah,
and how the elite works with their bloodlines and their organizations and their hierarchy. This concept of how do we get to a universal religion that's called Babylon.
Mhm.
And how does that affect not only Protestantism, but also inside the Catholic Church? And we kind of envision that there will be a split in the Catholic Church of conservatives and liberals, as we would understand how that split might work today. And that we want to also introduce how do we get to the 10 kings of the end time
Right.
empire?
Yeah.
And we call that the Global Alliance Coalition that sort of starts to bring that together in conjunction with the UN and to bring that about. And it's kind of interesting because we're starting to see some of that geopolitical nature of those 10 kings and how that sort of intersects to set up these rapid events that come like a flood in the end time. So
Mhm.
it's a fast moving, lots of interesting characters because we need to find a way to how do we get the message in throne rooms down to the earth?
Is it targeted towards believers, or could unbelievers pick this up and
Yes,
read this
both.
and
Both.
yeah, good.
We want it to be attractive to both, kinda like what book 1 that I wrote
Yeah.
is to try and pull all aspects of beliefs and positions in, and whereas book 2 is more, this is for Christians on how deep you can go in the Bible if you wanna go. So,
Mhm.
um, so yeah, this is designed to sort of captivate people based on what's going on today, all of
Yeah.
that hidden history and how that sort of ties in, and it will have an effect because there's a different so many different approaches to the end time chronology, and we kind of make clear in a couple excerpts that's in and around the book that this is we understand there's different end time chronologies, but this is how we think it might play out, and we want to
Yeah.
sort of get all of it because what happens with end time prophecy, you have so many different events and
Yeah.
how do they intertwine and how do they come together, and that's what we're trying to get onto the table. So what we're hoping is that people will really appreciate the narrative and look at different concepts like
Mhm.
what is what does the seven hills of Rome have to do with Babylon? And we call it this, and I call it in both in book 2 and in this book the septimonium,
Mhm.
and the location that we sort of think that the universal religion will move to inside the old cities of Rome. So, yeah, it's and now we're looking at the next book onto that, and I just laid down the next set of points, and again, we may not get that far into the trumpets. And what people don't understand, and again, what Bill was struggling to work with is why can't I just use part of the information? And keep it shorter. It's because it will be attacked from all sides.
Yeah.
So what we want to do, and we're going to be attacked anyways, but we want to be able to do is say, okay, they've considered these. We may not agree with all of that,
Mhm.
but now we see how they're interacting and how things are moving forward, and it makes
Yeah.
sense.
Oh, fantastic! I look forward to reading it. Um, in terms of this, if we're talking eschatology, and obviously, we're I think both of us would agree we're in a tumultuous stage right now. We may disagree on how far down the road, but one of the things that I would look out for in terms of um, sort of navigating the end times are end time conflicts. And I want
Yeah,
to ask you a question on this. So, if you take the Genesis 6 model that we have, Beneha Elohim, that are principalities and powers that certainly dominate their influence into the land. We know the promised land was full of their offspring, right?
yeah,
The Nephilim, right?
yeah,
So if that's the case, do you see that, like, the end time wars, such as, Ezekiel 38 as being the big one that people look to, but Jeremiah 49, the expulsion of certain individuals from Elam, and the culmination, some people have fall different degrees of this, but Psalm 83 and Isaiah 17, the destruction of Damascus. Do you see those as spiritual conflicts? And, if we look at, like,
yeah,
Gog and Magog, I know the Septuagint in Amos 7, verse 1, identifies Gog as the king of the caterpillars, the head of the locusts, which to me sounds like a demonic title. But
yeah. Yeah, that's a big question. So, I think what we're going to see is both an invisible conflict and a visible conflict, but with an emphasis on how that invisible merges with the visible in the end times. So, for those who are trying to bring things about through world government today and the polytheist religions, most as we would recognize, the most common one in the West would be Gnosticism or New Age Theosophy. They're the same religion, just evolutions of Gnosticism. Alice Bailey called 2025, interestingly enough, as the age of Lord Maitreya and the age of the externalization of the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is Greek for sacred assembly of archons, or that council of gods, as the invisible ones, as we would understand that. Well, an externalization of that infers that they're going to be visible again. So it's going to be like the days of Noah, as Jesus warned us about, that but not only did gods walk amongst us, but so did their offspring, the giants. Now, how they're presented are two different things, and how the brainwashing will come along to how we understand what's happening may be a bit different than what it's recorded in prehistory, because they're not trying to show their full hand until they have to. So we may get a lot of information that comes along with that, but we should be prepared for that. And so, like in the novel, in the Primo conspiracy, we're talking about the bloodlines, but we're also talking about the technology, and that it's going to, and we're going to hit that point where it's going to be like the days of Noah, and we're working through, okay, how much do we want to show of that, and how does that sort of fit in? So, but from a real world perspective, is we should be very much prepared for that. So when you now look at the externalization of that Gog war, it's kind of it's kind of a marriage of the invisible ones with the visible ones. And what do I mean by that? Well, Gog doesn't show up in the table of nations anywhere as a nation. Magog does, but Gog does not. And that Gog is actually a foreign word that's inserted into the Bible. And it only shows up in Ezekiel 38 and Revelation 20. Two separate wars, I would say, on that. Um, and that Gog of Magog is the chief prince of Meshach. Okay, so now if we understand Gog as who he is represented in prehistory, he's the offspring, originally before the flood, of a parent god named Iapetus, as is Magog, as is Elbion. Now these names show up again after the flood as well, but that's because it's a common tradition as it comes down, particularly through the royals, even to this day, of naming and keeping those names alive as part of their history. And so, like Prince Albert, for example, husband of Queen Victoria. I mean, that goes back to Albion when you take the etymology back. So, just to give sort of a quick example as to what I'm talking about. So, what does that mean for the Ezekiel 38 war? And for the timing, we should need to isolate that as well, because we get three references in there that shouldn't be confusing, but because people don't want to take the Bible for what it says, they want it to say what they want to believe, they
Hmm.
ignore those three references. So you get all sorts of different kinds of timing for that, but it's quite clear in terms of zeroing in on when it is. And so when we look at Ezekiel 38, it says, not only is it in the last days and also in the last years, that is akarith yom in Hebrew, both words. So days or years can be translated either way. So the translators in the KJV decided to throw a loop at that, just to, because maybe they wanted to cover their butts on that. They weren't sure how to
Yeah.
translate it, so they did both, or just to make things confusing. I mean, I'll leave that up to other people to decide. But so exact same two words in the same passage, translated slightly different, but meaning essentially the same thing. So we know it's sometime in the last Akarith, which is typically understood as you use that application in the book of Daniel and a few other places as the last 7 years.
Okay.
Okay. It's in the same period as it's really used in Daniel more often would be Moed, um, Ketz, which is the Ketz is end. So you're going to see end as in Daniel 26, and then you're going to get the appointed, which is Moed, and when it's used together, the appointed end, which is the time of the abomination in the last 3.5 years. So
Hmm.
this is in that last 7 years. Now in Ezekiel 39, after the defeat of the Gog War, that's when Second Exodus happens.
Okay.
So second Exodus happens in the last 3.5 years in the year of the Lord's favor or the year acceptable to the Lord, depending on which translation that you're happing on, either in the same year of the wrath or the year before, depending on how you want to put those together and interpret that. I look at it as two separate years, two separate events, but I can see how you could get it into one year. So that means that second Exodus is going to follow that.
Hmm.
And what's also kind of interesting about Gog is that if he is indeed a disembodied spirit made physical as the chief prince of Meshach,
Hmm.
Gog of Magog of Meshach, then he is either having an oikotarian or a clone type of body made for him, or he's possessing somebody.
Hmm.
Either or, he's going to be leading this army. And where do we get a reference where that might be possible? Well, we have Revelation 9 that happens before the midpoint of the last 7 years and in the trumpets, where the pit prison is open. And not only do fallen angels come out, but whatever disembodied spirits
Hmm.
might be in there. And these are where the terrible ones are located, as well as Ezekiel 32 talks about. They're in the pit prison and they're talking to another terrible one, probably Pharaoh Necho of that time period, as a Rephaim king. And so you have these mighty ones, and you get different names of these mighty ones that are in the pit in the uh, in the pit prison, but in the sides of the pit.
Hmm.
And these are the branch of the terrible ones that Isaiah 25 talks about that will be taken care of on a mountain in the end time war of Armageddon. So what I'm saying is we're going to have disembodied spirits, the worst ones, the ones who did the most terrible things to humankind, coming out, and they're going to want to interact in the world. And now we get out of an extension of that, as sort of an extension of the first woe, is this 200 million man army. So now we have a war that kind of lines up, at least allegorically, as you start to link things up with the Gog War. And so when we look at, is there another passage that we can sort of bring in to sort of bring this to a nice little circle? And there is. So in Joel 1 and 2, and then in verse 3, you get two different wars.
Hmm.
Joel 1 and 2 is this revelation war that comes before, as it says, the day of the Lord and into the valley of decision, which is the Armageddon war that's in Joel 3. Now, both in Ezekiel 39, you get these mighty ones that are described as these kings at this feast, right? Mighty ones is Gibborim, and Gibor in the singular, that would describe a giant in most cases. Not all cases, but in a lot of cases, it's used to describe giants, as in Genesis 6:4, mighty ones is Gibborim, just as Nimrod became a mighty one, a Gibborim somehow. And so you also get mighty ones showing up in Joel 1 and 2 and 3. So now you have a connection of giants to Ezekiel 32, Revelation 9, Ezekiel 38, and Joel 1 and 2 as part of this spiritual aspect being made sort of physical. And now, if you look at the description of who's leading that locust army, which you mentioned about the Septuagint, that is describing him as like a gag, essentially, uh,
Yeah.
or as Gog, depending on which translation you want to use, leader of the locust army. This is a locust army that's described in Joel 1 and 2
Hmm.
and in Revelation 9.
Yeah.
Now, in book 2, is if you've gotten to that point in book 2, I put 2 columns up of the description of the riders and the horses, if you can call them horses, in Revelation 9 and Joel 1 and 2, and it's identical. So it's talking about the same war. And in Joel 1 and 2, that happens again before Armageddon. It says, this is the greatest army that ever was or ever will be. It's
Hmm.
greater than the Armageddon War.
Wow.
And 200 million man army sort of backs that up. And you have these
Yeah.
chimera beings, like almost like a maybe an even more powerful being than what the original unicorn horses that the giants rode into battle on, that they're riding on. But I'm speculating on that. So now you have this great army that's going to be destroyed on the mountains of Israel just before the midpoint of the last 7 years, and at least 6 months before, because it takes that long to bury the army. And so this is the war that a false messiah is going to need as a counterfeit Armageddon
Mm.
to convince the world. An
Okay.
army that's the largest ever or
Yeah.
ever will be,
Yeah.
part of his pedigree. So in both in Luke 21 and Daniel um, 11, we see armies that Antichrist is moving into Jerusalem at the time of the abomination. And then he's going to be crowned king. He's going to take credit for winning this war, is my speculation as I've sort of put that together.
You just mentioned Luke 21, and Luke 21:11, it talks about these fearful sights,
Yeah,
these sights of terror. But the Greek word is phobotron, which is usually classified as monsters.
yeah.
Is that then this chimera aspect then?
Well, yeah, and we don't know to what effect and full development of the chimera technology is, which goes back to Greek mythology
Hmm.
and creating these hybrid type of beings that are even more hybrid than a hybrid human mating with an angel to create a hybrid giant, right? Because they have multiple characteristics of them. So a terrible one that's recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, named King Hababa of the Cedar Forest of Mount Hermon, of course,
Yeah.
was created to be the most terrible one to do the most terrible things to humankind.
Hmm.
So now we have an outside biblical reference to terrible ones, or the retim in the Hebrew of that is talked about in Ezekiel 32, and the branch of the terrible ones that's talked about in Isaiah 25. So, and we get more references of terrible of nations, and these terrible ones is in the bloodlines, like Nebuchadnezzar is one of the terrible ones, one of the terrible of nations. So one of the more powerful of the terrible ones.
I'm interested to know like, as in what that will look like. I'm
Yeah,
thinking, when we talk about chimera, obviously we've got the Greek mythology, but there's obviously more to that when we look at the Bible. Isaiah
yeah,
34, certainly in the wilderness section, it
yeah,
gives a depiction of a lot of different types of, I would say, identifiers of false gods. You
yeah.
know,
So, and
um,
we want to be careful of that with
yeah,
the
and
demonic disembodied spirits and clone bodies and
yeah.
humans. And
But
so,
sorry, can I just ask this
yep,
in terms
ask,
of
yep,
Isaiah 34?
yep,
Because obviously we have chimera, and I would
yep,
see them as different. But
yep,
Isaiah 34 talks about all of these different entities that would be
yeah,
like principalities. I think you'd agree with that,
yep, yes,
principalities. But there's Fahad Lilit, or the terror of the night,
yep,
that certainly in my writing, I've equated her as probably the source for the vampire myth.
mhm, yep.
Is if we get a return of Lilith,
As would Lilith be related to
yeah,
that aspect out of the same
yeah.
passage? Yeah,
And if we get
or
a
the
return
hag.
of Chimera, do
Yeah.
we get a return of that aspect as well, do you think?
Yes, we do. That's part of the externalization of the hierarchy. So when we look at um, what's going on with this chimera effect, we also need to understand the technology that would be part of it because of the great destruction it can bring. So
Hmm.
there's technology of weapons that the riders are going to have, but it's also by the descriptions, these things that they ride have some sort of technology involved as well. So part of
Hmm.
that transhumanism aspect is, I think, is linked into those weapons of war. So that's the one aspect of chimera and technology that I would have people start to think a little bit more, not as in separate, but how do they merge,
Yeah.
and then how does that get represented in within the destruction capabilities of these wars, because they have to be able to take on not just humans, they have to be able to take on loyal angels,
Hmm.
right? Because you're going to have a
Yeah.
war in heaven and you're going to have Armageddon, right? So they need to prepare the earth to be ready for that type of very highly advanced war. Now, back to these beings that you're talking about, we have two extraordinary passages in the book of Isaiah
Hmm.
about these beings. And you have Isaiah 13,
Hmm.
and you also have Isaiah 34, as you were mentioning. Different timetables for the celebration of what they're doing.
Hmm.
You have in Isaiah uh, 13, that's the preamble to Isaiah 14. It's the same prophecy.
Okay.
And it continues, and so you're starting with the allegory of the king of Babylon, right? And this is going to lead into the destruction of Babylon, and it's one of these unique prophecies that I talk about in book two that I call a uh, a dual prophecy, or maybe a better name for it might be something like uh, uh, bipartite.
Hmm.
So that it's unique because it has prophecies for the time of the prophets, in this case Isaiah,
Yeah.
but some unfulfilled prophecies for the end time, like the Assyrian, like what's happening with the reintroduction of the pit prison, as we see with Revelation 9, and then the sentencing to Satan to the pit prison at the end. But it also has interesting, unique characteristics that make this a unique prophecy, as are others which are structured like it, where it gives you important understanding of prehistory.
Hmm.
So, like in this case, different types of angelic beings, the throne in heaven, as you put 13 and 14 together. So, and even with possible antichrist allegories in there, because you have the Assyrian, have the king of Babylon, right?
Yeah.
And so Hail El in Isaiah 14:12, Hail El Ben Shakar, Hail El son of the morning, Lucifer son of the morning, which is an interesting translation, but that's a different rabbit hole. Um, he he is as Satan, as Jesus identified him in Luke 10:18, is Satan, who's the one who falls from heaven, who tried to raise his throne up to heaven. So that's kind of real context for how the end time is going to
Yeah.
end up as well, especially with that war in heaven. So now, as we look at Hail El, you have another word that people confuse with it. So Hail El is Heylel, but a derivative of an allegorical being as the king of Babylon is Helel.
Okay.
But it never shows up in the Bible, but it is a derivative Hebrew word.
Hmm.
And that's who they people confuse the king of Babylon as being like a Nephilim, or and but it's a derivative. Like
Yeah.
Halel is the source word, just as Nephal, uh 5307, for fallen and fallen ones, as you go Nephilim, is the source word. Derivative of that is Nephilim for the giant
Hmm.
fallen ones, right? So
Yeah.
connected, but not fully connected. Some of the meaning sort of carries forward. So this is the king of Babylon allegory, which is, you're getting two dual allegories for the end time. Not only is there going to be a religion of Babylon, but there's going to be a king of Babylon, and there's going to be the Assyrian. And you can look at the Assyrian and the king of Babylon as coming out of the same string of beast empires out of Mesopotamia, that
Mhm.
links right back to Nimrod. So it's giving us information here, and also starting to divine to give us an understanding that the end time is going to have this polytheist religion aspect of it for Babylon, which is more
Yeah.
going back to where you're talking about Jeremiah 49, 50, and 51 as you put those ones together
Mhm.
for the destruction of Babylon. So now getting back to the point, because again, these things you can go down so many different directions to explain things. So you have the same groups of beings in the destruction of Babylon in Isaiah 13 as with
Mhm.
the Armageddon battle that's described in the day of the Lord in
Right.
Isaiah 34. So they're celebrating both. And so the
Mhm.
question gets to be is why are they celebrating? One is they're going back to the old religion and Satan's going to be running the world and it's going to be a god that is introduced and a religion that's introduced that replaces Babylon because Antichrist and the King Kings destroy Babylon in Revelation 17 and he
Mhm.
replaces it with a new god that is the forefathers didn't know. So I think they're going right back to the original antediluvian religion.
Wow. Bill,
So
can
now,
I?
well,
Sorry, go
one
ahead.
more thing, because
Yeah.
so we're talking what we're talking about in different types of angelic beings, or most easily connected ones, are like dragons. Those would be seraphim angels.
Yes.
You have also satyrs. These are degraded seraphim angels,
Mhm.
right? You've got howling ones. These
Yeah.
are like jackal gods, you know, and it would be Halal in that howling aspect of it. Um, but all of a sudden now we have another group of god that we haven't really associated it, but
Uh-huh.
when we look at the pantheon, you have gods like Anubis, right, which are
Yeah.
howling gods, or biblically Nebaz, as it shows up in the book of Kings, that the Avim worship, that had a dog's head and a human body that they worshiped, just as they worshiped Nergal, which was a lion-headed god and a human body. So you start to get an understanding that these are celebrating fallen angels because they're bringing about as much destruction on humankind as they can, that ultimately ends up at Armageddon.
See, I'm glad to hear you sort of spell a lot out for us because when I talk about eschatology, I try and sort of relate to people that this, we often say Christianity, then there's the Satan, there's Hasatan and his demons, but we
Yeah.
don't take into consideration the hierarchical structure
Yeah.
within that kingdom. And one of the aspects that I'm looking at right now, and I've talked about this before, right now in the UK, as of today, there was an article coming out that they've had 15-minute cities trialing, but they're taking it to the nth degree now, where they're putting it in. This is the rollout, and that got me. Like I've talked about this, that the word for city in Hebrew is a year.
Yeah.
I and it's also the
City
word
of
for
Watch
yeah, it's
for
also the word that we
protection.
get.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and that kind of got me thinking that this is an agenda. This kind of control aspect is an agenda, a
Yeah.
spiritual agenda, not just a political agenda.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It always, it's what happens in heaven happens on earth in the polytheist belief system. They're playing out
Yeah.
the rebellion on the earth. And for people who didn't quite nail that connection on ear, IYR, that's
Hmm.
also the word for watcher angel in Daniel 4,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's also thought in polytheist religions that these more ancient cities of spectacular size and nature that go back beyond what we get sort of maybe listed biblically in terms of what we can isolate on a date. um, these were said to be built by the gods, so like the original city of Jericho, like is said dated back to 10,000 BC.
Hmm.
This was said to be originally built by the watchers because it's a watcher city,
Yeah.
and that's where the name starts to become associated with these great walls for protection. You would put watch guards up there, and you only you know built cities in the ancient world is for protection.
Hmm.
because the cities were walled cities. These are, and as they're specifically called in the land of the covenant, when we get, great examples of these great walled cities, they were there because of the wars that the giants were fighting, and humans would have to adapt to that same sort of environment and also have protection. So understanding the connection between the word watcher and city is very important, particularly as you start to move that into other religions and historical sort of aspects. So when we get to the understanding of the term watcher, as the Anunnaki were referred to, a cherubim angel, um, and their offspring were also called watchers.
Hmm.
And that terms from the Hebrew word igigi or igigi, and from gigi, which is for eye, as in to watch. Has the same
Okay.
sort of roots,
Yeah.
just as
Yeah.
ayer can mean to watch, as you take it back to its, or to be awake, as you take it back to UWR as the source word.
Yeah.
So it's all of a sudden you're seeing the same type of hierarchy. And then what you're talking about the hierarchy, we have to understand that. So when we're talking about Isaiah 14, he wanted to set up his throne in heaven to be like God, but he
Hmm.
gets cast down. So what he does, he counterfeits everything and sets up the council of the gods that he sits above. When you
Yeah.
get the confusion of 7 and 8 major fallen angels, he's the eighth. He sits
Yeah.
above, right?
Yeah.
And the council of the gods is where they ruled from, which is Nippur and Sumeria, Mount Olympus, and all these other places around the world that where the hierarchy was set up. Greek word hierarchy, um, and that you have a Hebrew word Saba, which means uh, a host of heaven, as it's translated, or an army of angels, rank and order, right?
Okay.
So you have this hierarchy where we use that, the hierarchy of the angels, and you have a council of the gods that's talked about in Psalms 82 that rules over the 70 nations in Deuteronomy 32.
Wow.
And
And
that's the hierarchy that the visible ones answer to.
so this externalization of hierarchy that Alice A. Bailey talks about, this is, like you say, this is the kind of coming back of that those principalities, those Beneha
Yes.
Elohim to a certain degree. So when we look at all of this and we see all of this happening right now, is there a significance that we're seeing ancient discoveries as well that kind of point, like, I believe in my theology that God does not want man with an excuse. So he knows, for instance, that at our core, we're morons. We need it spelt out to us to a certain degree. We need everything out to us. So the discovery of Jericho, for instance, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, do you think these are significant finds so that God is trying to, point, look, I know that certain archaeologists would point Göbekli Tepe as a
Yeah.
possible Babel site.
Yeah.
Is this significant as in, another time marker of where we're at?
Yeah, I think it is. And so what we do know is the polytheist forces want to bring about the new golden age, the new
Hmm.
Atlantis. So if you want to get there, you have to prepare the world for that. And they're trying to do it on a faster timetable than God will permit them. And that's where some of the sort of tension comes in and why they get so upset. They're trying to get things to happen faster um, than they're being permitted to happen. But that doesn't mean things aren't moving forward.
Hmm.
And so we're learning more and more about that hidden history. Excuse me. Um, I have a cold for the audience, so my nose is running a little bit. So sorry about that. So we're getting introduced to this hidden history, but manipulated in the way the ones who run this world want to present it. They
Hmm.
don't want to present that, hey, we're the demons, the offspring,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
we worship the angels who rebelled against the one God of the Bible. They want
Mm.
to put their own spin on that to say, hey, we're the good guys. Christians Jewish people, anybody of a monotheist persuasion are the bad ones and they worship an evil God. And the true evil angels are the ones that follow God. We're the ones
Mhm.
who free you. We're the ones who give you knowledge, and they spin everything upside down and inside out to make their case. So it's important to understand that we're going to see a rapid unfolding of events that is designed to change preconceived conclusions, but to cattle herd you into a direction that they want you to conclude.
Okay. Yeah. So can I just give you a little bit of a compliment to some? I think you've trained my ears to look for keywords now,
Yes,
so that whenever
that's good.
I've been I've been watching all of the sort of footage from the World Economic Forum from last
Yeah.
week, and my ears sort of just went ding 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 the other day
Yeah.
when I heard the leader of, I think it was Finland, refer to himself as an Atlantean.
Yeah.
He believes himself to be, you know, an Atlantean at heart. Now, in his sort of, I guess, explanation of that is that he believes in kind of order around the nations, combination, and all of that. But that's not what I hear. I hear it now through the lens of your books. So,
it,
in terms
it
of
makes a
that,
difference once you have that lens. Yes.
yeah, and in terms of that, you know, we know that Plato wrote about 10 kings
Yeah.
in terms of Atlantis, and I think it was probably before we started recording, we were kind of just mentioning that. But there's the things like the Board of Peace being put together
Yeah.
by Trump. And obviously, I'm not saying that that is this in action, but it certainly kind of represents an ethos to move towards that kind of world. Do
Yeah.
you think that we're starting to see the world reshape in that way?
Yeah, I do. And I was hoping that when Trump came to power, he would slow things down.
Hmm.
But even though he's anti the European dominance and the European bloodlines, as I always said, it's not that he was ever against the New World Order.
He
He
just,
just
yeah.
has a different model of how he envisions it. Same
Hmm.
as what she does, same as Putin has. And that's why he likes to be friends with them, because they all want a new world order. They just don't want to be dominated by the European bloodlines. So that's kind of the tension that's going on. But how do you get from where we are to 10 kings? And why is 10 kings important? Well, as you mentioned, in the New Atlantis, in the Golden Age,
Hmm.
brought the apocalypse. And referencing the book of Luke for the days of Noah, he links it to the days of Lot as well, so,
Yeah.
because it's transitioning into the destruction by fire reserved for the end time, as 2 Peter 3 talks about, versus the destruction of water. So it's like that, but only with fire is the implication there. And so how are we going to get to this days of Noah, or the days of Atlantis, as the allegory was set out by the Finnish politician, and that these 10 kings were of 10 empires trying to bring about a world government through military endeavors, through wars, that would have destroyed the whole earth
Yeah.
by fire, because they had more advanced technology than we have, because we're just catching up to them, kind of like the weapons we were envisioning for the Revelation 9 war, right?
Mm.
And the Armageddon war. And that in the Bible, and Atlantis was the golden age that Trump is talking about. So
Yeah.
again, they're using, and they're now saying it's a new world order, right? I get rid of the new, because we get new all of the time. Just go right to Nephilim world order. Right, and then
Yeah.
use that for the NWO and for the acronym. So, um, and that in the book of Daniel, we get an understanding of these empires that are coming, and the one that's coming is the seventh empire. And so in Daniel 2, they're described as 10 toes.
Hmm.
But in Daniel 7 and 8, we're getting these horns. So there's 10 horns that are talked about in Daniel 7. And in Revelation 12, 13, and 17, we get these 10 kings to line up
Yeah.
for this end time empire. So both in polytheism, and 10 is a standard number of antediluvian dominance and reign in all
Hmm.
cultures around the world. It's one of these inconceivable numbers that shows up all over the place, whether it's 10 generations or 10 kings. And so you had like 10 kings, like King Sudras of the Vedas of India conquered before the flood,
Hmm.
right? And he takes over. He was like this antichrist understanding, just as Maitreya is already in the pit in a specific location, and we get two different names coming out of the Eastern religions for the end time um, um, empire that the Gnostics have adopted Lord Maitreya. So you
Hmm.
have two different locations within in the other world where these two different kings, Shambhala would be the other location where the new Buddha would come from. But it's essentially the same allegory. So, but there will be opposing Antichrist because Antichrist needs to defeat an Antichrist figure, which is going to be Gog,
Yeah.
that I probably should have capped
Yeah.
off a little bit earlier. So again, we have the same sort of setup that's coming. And so, how do we get to 10 empires? If we look at the UN, they've got the world set up into 10 different groups of nations. The Club of Rome established slightly different. I'm not saying that's how the final map ends up.
Yeah. Hmm.
What I do know is those who are globalists are trying to establish 10 kings, but there's rivalries going on there on how you get there.
Yeah.
So is the new table circle round table perhaps ring lords being set up by Trump um, going to be the final outlook? Probably not. We are in the fig tree generation, but we're not in the last 7 years yet. So things are still developing.
Yeah.
But this will move us there more quickly.
Hmm.
And there is this determination to reestablish that balance of power and who's going to control things. I don't think Europe is going to take this sitting down. They're
No.
just very slow to recognize that they're going to have to form one, two, or three of their own kings
Hmm.
to work together. That's going to look different than they had previously imagined.
Well, that was the rhetoric coming out of the World Economic Forum, is that you had people like Ursula von der Leyen, Emmanuel Macron,
Yeah,
Christine Lagarde. They were all saying the same thing. They were talking really about a divorce from Washington,
yeah,
the standing army needed for Europe, continued power, and sort of advancement into a whole load of different technologies to secure a European, not a European Union, but more of a European empire is the way
yeah,
it's kind of looking.
yeah,
Now, I'm not, so I'm not, the way I would look at it is that Trump's doing this over here. And what I've seen by the certainly the Trump administration in this last year, I believe it's been a catalyst for
yes,
events, or it's
yes.
certainly been used by God to bring things around.
It is. And he has more respect and seemingly feels closer to his enemies than he does with his allies, which is you can't what
Yeah.
you can't and what people don't understand is well, there's going to be another president. No, you don't live in the US. I don't live in the US.
Mm.
What we think, not everybody in our countries, but what many think, you never put this genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
This is broken. And I can tell you, speaking from Canada, it never goes back.
Hmm.
I mean, will we be their neighbor? Absolutely. But will we voluntarily get into an economic association with them? No, we can never put our country at risk again.
Do you
So it
think then?
changes things.
Do you think, because this is where I'm kind of moving with my opinion, is it's kind of like two wings of the same bird, and I
Yes.
mean that from the point of view like we've had the whole rhetoric. I've done extensive teachings on tokenization and the digital ID structure still being implemented into the
Yep.
UK.
Yep.
But where it comes from is the Trump administration.
Yep.
It comes straight out of Larry Ellison, that one of the founders of Stargate. So, and again, these kind of new agey terms. Do
Yes,
you think that?
and blockchain technology
Yeah,
is the key technology going with it that China has developed.
yeah, and
And when they're gonna bring in the passports that
mhm.
died, but they're resurfacing with the continually advancing technology out of China, that's the platform they wanna introduce.
Well, it just I because I'm looking at this in Europe right now. They're bringing in this year IDAS 2.0, which is the digital wallet system.
Yes.
So everything needs to be from health to
Yep.
wealth, from health to your bank.
Yep.
Everything needs to be incorporated into a wallet. And it seems to me that there's not one nation in the world who's kind of standing, who's against this. They're just, like you said earlier, Trump's not against
Yep.
the Nephilim world order. He just wants a
Yep.
bigger part of it, or
Yep.
he just wants it in
Yep.
his way. Do you think then, with all that being sort of happening, you mentioned a few moments ago the Arthurian legends, King
Yep.
Arthur and stuff.
Yep.
Do you think we're starting to see that play out
Yeah,
in the?
I do, but I would also say is that two things. One, I'll just throw in here in the novel, we talk about this coming together called we call it the GAC, the Global Alliance Coalition, as
Oh, okay.
it's bringing it together, right? Just
Yeah.
to give it a name. So you have currently two economic systems being developed that could possibly down the road be interlinked,
Hmm.
but two systems, two different credit card systems, two different currencies, two different banking systems,
Yeah.
one by um, China and Russia and India in particular that are um, pushing this model that is separate
Hmm.
than the US one, but the US one is compatible with the European one. So again, I think that's
Yeah.
just internal rivalry as to the dominance who's putting that together. So what's interesting about that is if you're going to move into that sort of technology that binds you in a system, and there's two, and that we're talking about an effect of how does that affect the geopolitical economic associations. That now forces you into trading groups and
Hmm.
military alliance groups. And then if we look back to Daniel 2, we have 2 feet with 5 kings on each of the toes. You almost have these two different systems that are going to be developed that
Hmm.
looks like the beast system, but
Hmm.
it's not until it gets merged by
Yeah.
Antichrist at the midpoint of the last 7 years. So the Babylon system, let's just call it that, and we'll use another term as well that the polytheists will use. This is the system that they're trying to bring about. We're still in the age of Babylon
Hmm.
that will be replaced by the Leviathan system when Antichrist comes to power. And of course, you have this multi headed Hydra Leviathan beast empire rising up that Antichrist is going to become the eighth empire out of that as part of the 10 kings. But so I would look for two of those systems, but there's going to be a way to bring that together when Antichrist comes to power so he can introduce the mark. But Babylon grows rich
Hmm.
off of this system, and everybody's going to say, this is the beast system. And then you're going to have Antichrist type figures amongst these 10 kings because they're all rivals. There can only be one, but Antichrist rises amongst those 10 kings and then overthrows three and comes to power with very few people at the midpoint of the last 7 years. So you're going to have people say it's the beast system in place, and they're going to have all of these choices to say that's Antichrist, and one rises to a level like Gog for Antichrist to take credit in winning the war for to bring him to power.
Could this be then, if there's two systems, could it be, and I am properly speculating here,
Yep.
private and public? Because when we talk about
Yeah.
tokenization or blockchain technology, you've got private under BlackRock who are full on for this. Then you've got what should be public, but they're not really, the Bank of International Settlements,
Yeah.
which are a nefarious bank,
Yeah.
funded World War II, supported
Yeah, I know.
the
It's
regime,
notorious.
and, and were used primarily through, which makes me think that there's a
Yeah.
spiritual context to this.
Yeah.
Were used primarily through Heinrich Himmler, who
Yeah.
Heinrich Himmler and
Well,
Ariosophy, you know?
the system will be all around the world.
Yeah.
Same coin, two different
Okay.
sides.
Yeah.
And so the system is National Socialism,
Hmm.
just as was in Germany, where it's not all owned by the state, it's a partnership between the oligarchs,
Yeah.
as Revelation likes to. I will use the oligarchs that are in Revelation 6 and Revelation 18 and 19, along with the royals who control all of the merchants, all of the trade, as what Antichrist sits above and receives benefit from, and Babylon before that. Um, this will be that kind of setup where you have a partnership between the government, religion, and um, private business with the oligarchs, just like it was in Germany. It's socialist system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but it's also a religious socialist system because Babylon controls things in the first half with that system and grows rich, and then Antichrist controls that with his universal. And how you complete that circle is understanding that when Hitler came to power in 1933, he created the Reichschurch, which I talk about in book one as Ariosophy, which is
Yeah.
that Pan-Aryan overlay onto Theosophy that you were mentioning that comes out of Gnosticism and takes their lineage back to Tula or Thule,
Hmm.
which is the northern Atlantis mythos. Whether it's a different ancient civilization or the same one, they're both blonde hair, blue-eyed, pale-skinned giants, as they believe they take their genealogies back to.
So this is basically like it reminds me of what we sort of touched on a bit last time. This is taking the Gnostic kind of New Age agenda that comes from polytheism in in the ancient world, and it sort of morphs through history
Yeah,
until it gets to now, and it's starting to come. Because I don't know if you agree with me that we had the Third Reich, but what I've really seen is the Third Reich through Himmler's investment after or coming to the end of World War II
yeah,
never really went away. It just embedded. So certainly in industrialization in post-war Germany, certainly in Operation Paperclip, all
yeah,
of those different things, it just
yeah,
embedded the ideology, and now we have things like the WEF.
yeah.
You know,
Well, and look at the long-term strategy on this. So, as we mentioned, you have bloodline rivals, but there can only be one Antichrist, which is
yes, I know
one
because
of
you
the
ruined
things.
that anger for me.
With-
Still,
so, what they do in Europe is they create the communist virus, which is as harsh socialism as you can have, um, and they bring down the Putianin bloodline, which is the parent family to the Romanovs, um, through communism, right? But that's not the system that they want, and it goes rogue. And so, what do they create? Well, they create the system that they want, as National Socialism in Germany, but that goes rogue. So they have to, rethink things out. But National Socialism is that partnership that they want in place. But in the meantime, they take communism and they put that virus into China in World War II, bring down another bloodline, get
Mhm.
control of the, basically, defrock the Yamato bloodline of Japan, and now, as you see, as history unfolds, you see more National Socialism, which is, I think, the system in Russia. It's the
Yeah.
system communism has migrated to. It's the system Europe has been moving to, and it's the system that North America is moving to. So it's a worldwide system of that to set up a worldwide Babylon system. But again, we have to factor in these rivalries all the way through.
It's amazing when we think about this because you go, how does that ideology survive all of those things, and not just the National Socialism, but the underpinning of, I guess, Gnosticism through Ariosophy.
Yeah,
So if you look, you mentioned earlier about Sodom. Was
yeah,
Sodom kind of a Gnostic
yeah,
embediment of, like, was it a Gnostic society in
yeah.
Sodom?
Yeah, it's so if we look at Gnosticism, it is trying to unite the old religion, right?
Hmm.
It's bringing in all sorts of uh, things to unite into this universal religion that I call in book one global Gnosticism. There'll be branch religions no matter how they get there until Antichrist implements his version.
Hmm.
But as we understand that, then the religion of the antediluvian religion, we would know, as I like to call Enochian mysticism in book one, but Zoroastrianism is the religion both before and after the flood.
Hmm.
That is the religion of the giants in the ancient religion. So Zoroastrianism is, we would understand that showing up in Persia, which is the uh, Aryan Persians version, which is the Avesta version versus the Sanskrit version, where Indo-Aryans also settled into the Indus Valley, which is why you have so many different similar names of the gods, and it comes right through even into Syria, and the Hittites are using the same names that come out of the Sanskrit version. And so this is the religion that restarts at Babel, where we get our allegory for. That's
Hmm.
introduced by Hermes, or Hermes Trismegistus, or Harmine, as it's showing up in the Polychronicon in the history of Freemasonry. And this is the one that he finds the knowledge of the antediluvian world and its religion at the Great Pyramid and takes it to Nimrod to start at Babel. Well, the giants already have their religion as well. That's working sort of together. So there's like two different branches of that religion right out of the gate. But that is the religion that they're trying to bring back. So when we link back in Lord Maitreya, that goes back to Mitra, which is Mitra in the original Proto Indo Aryan European and Sanskrit. And that is one of the major gods of Zoroastrianism, which would be an equivalent to Shiva, and both incarnate into either Sudras or Maitreya for the new Buddha in the end time. So again, they're telling the same story, in that you have this same type of parallel story in those two sort of primary polytheist religions that are surviving throughout our history. So what we're looking at is the religion of the giants that they're trying to get us connected back to into Babylon. And this is the religion coming downstream biblically, we understand, as the daughters of Babylon. That is the religion and organizational structure of all of the beast empires.
Well, if you have Mitra, and you're saying Mitra is the same as Shiva because the destroyer,
Yeah.
would Mitra be Apollo as well?
Um, yes, but not as a straight line to Apollo. Apollo
Yeah.
is a different god, as what a destroyer god would be
Mhm.
in the Greek um, hierarchy. But Apollo comes is a derivative of Apollyon. It's part of the same sequence
Yeah.
of words, but not the same words. So definitely sort of connected. And Apollo is an offspring god, not a parent god. So
Yeah.
another thing to sort of keep in mind on that. So a better relationship to Mitra, um, and Shiva is kind of a composite god that sort of comes out of another god from the antediluvian. It's I won't go into the minutiae on that, but that's sort of as you get into the history of Shiva and how Shiva comes about. But both of those would be more closely related with Azazel as a destroyer god,
Okay. Okay.
right? So a destroyer god. with Azazel, he is the one that provided most of the illicit knowledge to the antediluvian world. We understand him as a scapegoat,
Hmm.
so a satyr god, even though he
Yeah.
was seraphim, he's degraded.
Was
And that
Pseudonos as well, maybe, or Pan? Would Azazel have a
Yes,
connection
yes,
there? Yeah.
yes. And so, and there's many goat god satyrs
Yeah.
that show up, like Bacchus, and I won't go through all of them, but um, and also as you connect that into Cernunnos as a two-horned god, and Cern as you get that into the Etruscan pantheon, also pronounced Kern with a K, it's pronounced
Hmm.
both ways, and that's Proto-Indo-European for two-horned god.
Yeah.
And that's the name they use for an acronym for CERN that can go interdimensionally and maybe try and get their gods out of prison. But that's another rabbit hole. So, saying with the connection to Azazel, know that Baphomet, that the Templars worshipped,
Hmm.
and the one that provided them the knowledge in their mythos, that means Father Mitra.
Okay.
So now you see how that connects to Azazel because he's the one that's worshipped, and he's the one who is depicted in Roslyn Chapel as upside down with his rope in like a S or a Z in behind it with the pearls of wisdom. Um,
Hmm.
and so Mitra in Sanskrit and Indo-European means a bond or a bond or an alliance. Well, what's interesting is that uh, Antichrist is going to be connected to one that comes up out of the pit prison, according to
Right.
Revelation
Yeah.
17.
Yeah.
And both Mitra and Shiva, they incarnate and particularly incarnate into either Sudras or Lord Maitreya. And Lord Maitreya, that etymology goes back to Mitra, Maitreya. It's just transliterated, um, they receive an incarnation. Whoever this Antichrist figure is, receive an incarnation at the end of time when Shiva or Mitra both destroy the world by fire and then restart the new world again in a creative sort of fashion. So it's telling the same story
Hmm.
as what we get in the West through Azazel and a connection back to the destroyer that comes up out of the pit prison in Revelation 9, just before the midpoint. And so he's going to have a relationship as well as Satan with Antichrist somehow, some way, probably in an incarnation aspect.
So, in Alice A. Bailey's book, The Externalization of Hierarchy, they talk about an invocation of Mitra.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is just I taught on this before, but it was that obviously they used the lotus flower, and it's a certain depiction of the lotus flower in the insignia,
Yeah.
and that same flower was used by the United Nations as last year as marking the International Year of Cooperation. So I kind of connected the two, thinking the two were together. And it makes me think the United Nations, NATO, World Economic Forum, International Monetary Fund, Bank of International Settlements. Has there been an infiltration? Because you mentioned the Knights Templar.
Yeah.
Has there been like an infiltration into pop culture, into banking, into institutions that has allowed for all of this sort of, I guess, embedded neo paganism or Gnosticism ready for
Yeah.
a resurgence? Has
Yeah.
it? Have they been instrumental?
Yes, banking is always a key part of it, just as preparing people for the understanding of Mitra.
Hmm.
So I'll just cover both off quickly here. The first part is the Mitra aspect, is that we're going to be told you've been worshiping Mitra all along, not Jesus. And you've been doing that because you celebrate the birth date of Mitra on December 25.
Hmm.
And Mithra was the religion that was merged into Christianity with Constantine,
Yeah.
right? So they you have to understand that they look at things through millennia in
Hmm.
terms of the planning of the strategy of this Leviathan that they're creating. And so with the banking aspect, we would look at that and bringing that back to the Davos crew. And now that's merging with politicians there all the time, not just the business leaders, and all going back with their marching orders, and scientists in terms of getting AI up to speed so they can get their chip implementation technology in place.
Hmm.
And it was lagging, which is why they had to double down last year on it. And they answer into the committee of 300 families in the hierarchy of organizations. And they handle all of the international economic associations, whether it's international banking, whether or not it's world trade, anything to do with trade, money, and economics, because without control of that, the Royals do not have power.
Yeah.
And so they set up banking to do two things. One is to control the world, but also to hide their wealth and keep
Hmm.
it off the books. So always keep in mind there's going to be unexplained wealth that hits the market in these empires, and particularly from the Europeans downstream. Um, and it gets there through the Knights Templar in the beginning. And of course, they're taken down in 1307. One of the things that the Knights Templar created was modern banking. And I
Yeah.
cover this off in detail in book one. And so when they went down, their assets were enormous, and they didn't want to lose all of the assets. So, you had in Spain and Portugal, you had two kings there that set up separate new Templar organizations like the Order of Christ and the Montesa Order to inherit those assets so the Roman Church wouldn't get it. Some of the assets went to the Sinclairs in Scotland who set up Freemasonry, but most of the French wealth went to Switzerland, where um, less than 100 years before that, the Templars' sister organization of the Knights of St. John had already set up a location there, and that's where they put that wealth, which is why Switzerland has that white cross on their flag. That's the start of modern banking. So
Hmm.
you had to replace banking outside the church with the fall of the Templars. And so they created the Bauer family, who changed their name to the Rothschilds with the setting up of the London Bank in the early 1800s or late 1700s. And so that became the worldwide banking, who I think in the 90s they moved all of their banking wealth and system to Switzerland. And
Hmm.
to get control of the banking inside of the church, the Roman church, the Vatican banking, the Montesa order had a leader in the 1500s named Francis Borgia, part of the black nobility of popes. And his grandfather was a pope, and there was more than one Borgia as a pope. And also was in the court of the king of Spain of that time. And so he sponsors Ignatius of Loyola and
Hmm.
gets him out of jail of the inquisitors, I think in 1529, and through his papal connections and with the king being the Holy Roman Emperor of that time
Hmm.
of Spain, they get papal bulls set up the Jesuits. In
Yeah.
1550, Francis Borgia resigns as the Grand Master of the Montesa Templar Order and joins the Jesuits. By 1565, he's got control as the leader of the Jesuit order. And then he, with the King of Spain, they start doing wars and invading Italy, and they bankrupt Italy. And banking goes to the Jesuits, led by Francis Borgia, who moves that banking to Switzerland. And in places like Switzerland, they can keep all of their wealth off the books. So you
Hmm.
think that people think that Gates or Elon Musk or Bezos or whoever you want to throw out there are the richest people in the world? That is paltry. They are poor by comparison to the off the books wealth that the
Yeah.
Royals have around the world.
That reminds me. I Do you remember a few years ago? It was King Charles had said that it was a discussion. He says about an individual on the scene, and will need to. I think it was he will need trillions at his disposal.
Yeah.
and it was talking about some individual, and it was kind of like a faux pas. He had just sort of openly said what he shouldn't have said. But I guess there seems to be so much coming together. And you mentioned Baphomet there,
Yeah.
and Leviathan, and when you look at the is it the church it was the Church of Satan. They have the Baphomet figure, and then they
Yeah.
have the pentagram, and then they have Leviathan spelt out, the five letters of Leviathan spelt out around it.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because this is where I sort of think this is it's spelt out around it, five letters, so 360 degrees divided by five is 72. Is that specific? Because I see 70 and 72 specific in terms of the nations back
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
the principalities.
Yes. So imagine, and 72 is an important number.
Yeah.
And we're not always told how, we're not always, we're never told how that number sort of gets there.
Hmm.
Um, but you can sort of work it through to, I think, to a certain degree. You're going to have 70 gods of the council, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you have, seven major gods that are represented in the days of the week or the wandering stars. And so you get a term in the book of Enoch, the tens of the sevens, right?
Hmm.
So that's part of the hierarchy that you're getting to the 70. We also talked about one other one when the eighth of the seven, the one that sits above, which is Satan. So now you're at 71.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is that at the top of the ancient pantheon, there were two major gods, one female, one male. But particularly at the top, as in Sophia in Gnosticism, and the
Okay.
male force that she worked with to create the 12 archons of the parent gods. Um, the female goddess is higher than the male god,
Hmm.
like the queen bee.
Yeah.
So, if that's the case, and we're going back to the days of Noah, then that mother goddess has to come back,
Hmm.
right? And that mother goddess is likely the consort of Satan. What's really interesting in the Leviathan narrative and the allegory that sort of goes with it is that it's the female that's killed in prehistory.
Okay.
And if this is an allegory for Satan and his consort, perhaps Rahab is the name, because you get another name for a Leviathan
Yeah.
in the book. I'm speculating as I'm piecing this together for you. Um, but you can't kill an immortal being. Certainly God can,
Hmm.
because he created them, but you can send them to the pit prison, just as the fallen angels went to, right? And so that's kind of being like dead. And in polytheism, when the offspring gods overthrow the parent gods, they said that they killed the parent gods. Well, they're not, they're in the pit prison, right? They're like that in the same sort of word. And then in Isaiah 27, you have this male Leviathan who's going to be slain in the end time.
Yeah.
Well, that's really weird. If so, we either have this giant Leviathan creature that's swimming in the oceans, or this is also an allegory for Satan, because he's going to end up in the pit prison in the end time at the end of the last 7 years. And if you open up the pit prison, guess who might come out? Would be the female Leviathan. And so when we look at this story of Leviathan, it is told in all cultures and religions around the world.
Hmm.
So you have like Tiamat, consort of Absu in the Sumerian pantheon, that would be is slain. You have, Yam and Lotan, and you have Verta being destroyed by Indra in the Sanskrit accounting of it. And again, I have a chapter in book one where I give these different variations, but they're telling about the same story. It's just the
Yeah.
female that's killed. So you may see both that woman coming back, and then the dealing with both the woman and Satan. Um, by the end of the last 7 years. But what's interesting is that that woman might be the same woman who rides the beasts of empires
Mm,
that
yeah.
is destroyed at the midpoint of the last 7 years when Antichrist comes to power. So again, you even see a rivalry amongst the the parent gods, right? That might be going on in the end time.
It's crazy how because it just seems like well, since Genesis 6, there's been this under the under the covers kind of narrative going along, like a Nephilistic news cycle, trying to continually prime, prep, and prepare us for something at the end.
Yeah,
In Irish, by the way, we have a chaos demon that is a sea serpent with the big heads, the seven heads.
yeah,
It's called Oilfeist. And one of the things that I noticed, because I want to ask you this, because in terms of structures, I know that sounds weird, but when I'm talking to you, my head just starts going and I start thinking of different things. So these aren't the questions I started with. um, when we've got Irish history, we've got a whole load of a mesh of neo paganism
yeah,
and at its roots, Gnosticism. In
yeah,
fact, when it comes to Samhain, Halloween, one of the key figures that is instrumental to this is Simon Magus from Acts 8.
yeah,
So the theory is in Irish history, Simon Magus came here. He taught Mugrath, the head druid, and then he performed a whole load of things on the hill of Clachta, which is the hill associated with the bonfire of Halloween. And it was all this was the worship element set up by Simon Magus. But what's sort of just sparked in my head here, you've got all these different structures, these megalithic structures at these sites. But Simon Magus's story in this as well, he tells of you're told it in the legend that he had a flying machine, right? That Mugrath, the head druid, had this flying machine. When you read the description of this, it's a wheel within a wheel.
yeah.
And I guess what I'm asking is all of this associated to come to a conclusion in which we're going to have a UFO, UAP kind of disclosure in which people are going to go, oh, well, Christianity, we'll just throw that out.
Yeah, it's part of it.
Yeah,
And so we need to understand that they've been preparing us for that idea, like with the author of the wheel of the chariots of the gods who just died. I mean, that they morphed that into that's just interplanetary travelers versus interdimensional travelers.
yeah.
Um, and so, but it's that wheel that's really important because the wheel is essential in many metaphorical applications in polytheism, from the eight Sabbaths that you mentioned, one
Mhm.
of, and the wheel.
Yeah,
So the wheel worship, and you have wheel imagery like with Atlantis. You have wheel imagery at Gilgal Raphaim, wheel of the giants at the foot of Mount Hermon. And you have the wheel of the Mayas. I mean, it goes from micro to macro in that
yeah.
understanding. But as we get into the connection to, and it is the religion of the giants, as we get into how that starts to intersect with the gods and aliens, understand that particularly shown in the Greek religion, you have these horses that are carrying the chariot of these gods. That people um, that is connected to Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10
Hmm.
in the Bible. And so, whether it's Apollo or whether it's Zeus, um, their throne is being pulled by these six horses. As you take that back to an older imagery, it's actually a unicorn horse, but there's no wings, so it's not Pegasus. It's something different. And when you understand that unicorn, and I write about this in book 2, is unicorn is understood in polytheism as an allegory associated with a specific watcher, in this
Hmm.
case, cherubim, as they associate it with, and the horn represents in that allegory this explicit knowledge of whatever it is that the cherubim provides, that's and also understood as the third eye or the communication of that knowledge.
Mm,
Then all of a sudden you have the same imagery understood as a cherubim that's going on in Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10 that pull the chariot, pulls the image of the of God's chariot. And where it connects is those concentric wheels that the throne sits on, or the chariot, right? But it's the wheel. And where it's talking about these concentric wheels, that's the Hebrew word Gilgal. But when it's talking about the being that's within the wheel,
mhm,
it's not Gilgal, but it means circle as well, or a wheel. And it's Ophan. Now, where do we get that word in anywhere else? Well, we get Ophanim watchers as throne watchers in the book of Enoch,
mhm,
and put the IML plural in it. So and this is not a cherubim, it's cherubim like, but it's not cherubim because one of the faces of the Ophanim in the Hebrew is the face of a cherubim, which has four faces. So it tells us nothing in terms of what that other face is. Um, so it's distinct and it's a separate sort of being. So now, if you want to connect that what the Bible is talking about is the same as what the polytheists will say is the same polytheist allegory, as they will lay, but not monotheist, but polytheist allegory for the gods who are actually advanced aliens in their UAPs or UFOs or whatever you want to call them. They can make a straight line and start wrapping in all religions around the world.
wow. See, in fairness, I had never ever seen that before. So I'd always sort of used them synonymously, as in the circular form Gilgal and Ophanim, but I'd never. So the outer wheel is Gilgal and the inner wheel is the
Yeah, the
Ophan.
being, yeah, the Ophan, yeah.
So it would that then be classed? And I know, sir, I've talked to L.A. Marzulli about this as well. You know, because some people have a trouble getting their head around the idea of technology and heaven and
Yeah.
things like that. Would this be a technological aspect around with the angel contained within?
Yes. So what we're seeing is one of two things. We are either seeing how it is shown in heaven in a way for Ezekiel to describe, or how it's made physical
Hmm.
in the physical universe in terms of having a movable throne of God. And what's also interesting as you get into the book of Enoch, it says God has two locations where his throne can rest in Sheol.
Wow, this is see this. I might keep this last so this sort of 4 or 5 minutes that we've talked here for my private group because this is awesome and I need to get something as well. So, so if in the two places in hell are in
Yeah,
Sheol,
yeah,
so I know that there's a certainly from the Judeo perspective of how kind of cosmic geography would be. You would have earth, you would have the heavens, you would have maybe the mountain of God going up, and then you would have Sheol under the earth. But then there's these pillars sometimes associated in art to Tehom, which is chaos, and Tannin, another name for Leviathan.
yeah.
So where would be the places that the throne of God could rest within Sheol?
Well, physically in that another dimension, as I would,
Oh,
as I understand it. So when you look at how Enoch is describing this, um, it's talking about inner earth, and I'm not saying there isn't a physical aspect to
yeah,
what's under the earth, but the size and the scope of what's going on in the earth can't be occupying that same space. I mean, it's
yeah,
absolutely massive place and different locations
yeah,
in it. And so you would imagine a place where spirit beings would be in a spiritual form, as in heaven. But this is, they can't, they're not permitted into heaven. So they're going to have a place that occupies the same area. And so when we have accounts that are in other religions, the best one is understanding Nibruki and Nibiru. And so
Okay.
Nibiru, um, people associate as a planet,
Mm,
and some people as another planet that's coming back into, our galaxy. But it's a planet and a crossing, but it's not the Earth.
hmm
But it's in the earth. And Nibruki would be the Sumerian word for the actual earth. So it's this crossing sort of aspect, just as we get in Ezekiel 39 with these passengers or travelers, right? Which is
Yeah.
Hebrew abar, which is associated with death and crossing over. It's used in other passages for death, like in the book of Job and elsewhere. You have these beings that are crossing over,
Right.
right? Another
Yeah.
dimension. And in the polytheist version, the gods live in another dimension, just as in the Ugaritic text, the Raphaim, as one quick example, would lead their dead kings there to be there after they died, right?
hmm
But they could only do it under certain circumstances. But in other places in Ugaritic texts, they're there for other occasions. So it's hard to know what kind of access that they had. Baal enters through the gateway of Hades. I'll leave it up to people how many times, whether it's every day, every season, whatever the period is, that he inspects both of his realms. And that's the same place that Jesus announced his church, that the gates of Hades won't will be able to overthrow this church that he's establishing. And so we have that place and I think within the earth that's physical that we have to deal with. Then we have this other place that's in another realm. And in that realm, you also have the pit prison
Okay.
in this other realm,
Yeah.
in this other dimension. So when we get the word hell, it's a composite of different places, and we need to separate the lake of fire, which may be in that same realm or another location, from Shades and Sheol, which is where the gods rule from and where the pit prison is located in. And then there's the physical underworld.
So in that setting, right? If you've got obviously what is seen as the gates of hell or the cave of Pan or anything like that,
Yep.
could these be specific portals? I know people don't like it because it sounds like a new age term, but Psalm
Yeah.
26,
Yeah.
windows or doors, whatever, right? Could these be specific? Because this is what I was sort of hinting at earlier with the idea of like megalithic structure. Megalithic structures in Ireland and stuff,
Yeah.
they're always seen as a place in which you go into Tír na Nog, the
Yeah.
other world.
Yeah.
Is that what it's sort of boiling down to? So if we meet if Moses was on the mountain with God and Israel were to have dinner with Moses and God on the mountain,
Hmm.
and we see a counterfeit of that with Babalu and Babel and stuff,
Yep.
is that what it is? These are portals of influence to interdimensional.
Yes, and Babalu would mean gateway of the gods in
Yeah,
Akkadian,
yeah,
right? So, I mean, it's constitutional in polytheism that there's multiple dimensions, and that's where the gods exist, and that's the other world. And so, biblically, I mean, we get really strange passages about in the earth and stuff like that, and I won't go through the whole hollow earth stuff. That's a kind of a show in itself. There's so much material there, but I'm going to walk people through something that, if you don't mind, that
yeah. Go for it.
it helps us to understand that there is this sort of dimensional world that's for the spirits. So it starts in First Peter 3 when Jesus is in the grave. So his physical body um, shouldn't be there, but it probably is. But he's dead, right? And he's doing something new. And he's going to go to, while he's in the grave, he's going to go talk to the spirits that are in the prison who did the crimes in the time of the days of Noah. These are the gods and the terrible ones that he's speaking to. So now what's interesting is what's he saying to them? And what he's saying to them comes out to us in a few different passages, I think. So in Colossians 2:14 to 15, you have an interesting passage that is talking about these spoiled principalities and powers, and also about the rudiments, which are elementals there, another class of spirit beings that also talks about in Galatians 4, but I want to stay on track with this. And in Colossians 2, he is showing that he triumphed over them. Jesus is. And also in that passage is telling us not to worship angels, and to be free of these rudiments or these elementals. Um, so that is really strange. But we now connect that triumph to a spectacle where he's making of them in Colossians as you go further back in. He's creating this spectacle, I think, in about verse 10 there. And this is directly related to Ephesians 4:8, where it says, Jesus took the captivity captives when he ascended on high. So this is referring to a quote out of Judges 5:12 for prisoners, captivity captives. It's really weird language, and it shows up one other time, and it shows up in Psalm 68. And now that's the rest of the story. So Paul is quoting Psalm 68 in Ephesians 4 and also talking about it in Colossians 2. And there, that's where these prisoners are taken to Bashan, to Mount Hermon, where sentence is pronounced to them at that time. And that's the spectacle. And it's called in 68:15 the Hill of Bashan, which is Mount Hermon, for the accursed or the accused ones that are being sent there. So if you want the whole story of what Jesus is doing in First Peter 3 in another dimension, where this pit prison is located, where the spirit beings are kept, read Psalm 68. But understand, Paul is telling us about this, and that all of this is interdimensional stuff.
Funny enough, I was actually teaching on Psalm 68 on Sunday. Um, I was teaching that what you've got, if you take the Ugaritic of Bashan as
Yeah.
BTN, which is the serpent, and
Yep.
it's showing you that the enemy's always trying to create that place, that high place,
Yep.
counter to God, Isaiah 14.
Yep.
Funny enough, in that sort of desire, do you think it's by chance that the World Economic Forum meet in Davos, the most elevated town in Europe, or you have a UN
Yeah.
outpost at the top of Mount Hermon?
Yeah.
Do you think they're
The,
aware of this, or do you think this is
yes.
just a spiritual influence behind them?
No, that's the location of the Council of the Gods.
Hmm.
And even in the Ugaritic texts, it's in the Council of the Gods. I have a friend I do a lot of shows with, and he said, I don't like how you're referencing Mount Hermon as Mount Saffon as being the same. Can we do a show on that? And because he says my research, and he says I know you're doing the same research from the same books that I am, so I don't know how you get there. So okay, let's do a show on it. So Mount Saffon is usually located by Tyr, along the ocean, by the so-called secularists, right? These
Okay.
people of, but that word Saffon in the Ugaritic text, which uses the original Semitic, means north.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when it's talking about Mount Hermon in the Old Testament, it's sometimes referred to at least two or three times. This is the mountain of the north, Mount
Hmm.
Hermon, Saffon in Hebrew.
Hmm. Yeah.
And this is the same place where the cave of to the gateway to Hades is located at the bottom of Mount Hermon,
Yeah.
that Baal came through and is recorded in coming through every season. However, I don't think I quite agree with that. I think he came with that translation, but doesn't matter. He comes through that gateway to inspect his empire in the Ugaritic text. So they've located it for some silly reasons, totally disconnected from the meaning of the word,
Hmm.
and Mount Hermon. But so I think it's just more misinformation to not connect those two.
Yeah.
Mount Hermon is Mount Saphon. And we also know biblically that Mount Hermon is also called Sirion. It's
Hmm.
also called um, Shinir, and it's also called Sion or Sion
Hmm.
in Deuteronomy 4. And that the original name wasn't Mount Hermon, likely, by
Yeah.
all of this. And Mount Hermon, or Hermon, as you will know because of your knowledge of Hebrew, comes from Haram, curse or cursed. Its
Hmm.
name was changed, and this was one of the mountains of God
Yeah.
that was usurped by the pantheon on earth, where they put their counterfeit council of the gods, as they would do. And this is the same place where Armageddon's going to be fought. Har, the mountain of the assembly, Moed or Moged,
Yeah.
Har Megiddo, Megiddo as it's transliterated from Hebrew into English from Greek because the letters don't mesh up. Um, and all of a sudden things make perfect sense.
Mm.
And so why are they meeting at Mount Hermon, not Mount Saphon, as they say is at Tyr? Because
Hmm.
that's Saphon. That's where Baal, the council of the gods, ruled from. That's where his father El ruled from. That's the most holiest mountain on the earth. It's part of the Eden from the Nile to the Euphrates to Mount Hermon in the north and to the Red Sea, same land given to Abraham in Genesis 15, same dimensions. And that this is the mountain that they are counterfeiting everything on for their dominion over the earth. And we know they have dominion over the earth for a little bit longer period of time because was made very clear by Satan to
Hmm.
Jesus when he said, if you kneel with me, and he showed him all of his empires around the world, I will give you these empires. He is the one who sits above the council of the gods
Yeah. Yeah.
for a
That
little bit
makes so much.
longer. Yeah. So everything starts to make some sense once you start to piece things together. And the Bible gives us clues and hints all over the place. And when you put them together, they start to form a story. So
And then when you see the different narratives, because I think what you're saying then is that if you take the Grecian model, well, that's that nation telling the same story from their
yeah.
perspective, and adding in, if we've got Mount Olympus, and then
Yeah.
and we've got Mount Errigal over here in Ireland, which is
Yeah.
associated as the mountain of the gods,
Yeah.
and it just seems to be that
So
this is
imagine, yeah,
sorry, go on.
imagine it flowing out this way. So you have this central mountain, and
Hmm.
then you have the hierarchy of the seven, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
let's say you have seven original civilizations, they would have their own holy mountain, right?
yeah,
But then there's 10 nations that go with each under that seven, and they may establish their own mountain and hierarchy. And then
yeah.
if there's other ones that branch off from those nations as the world people spread around the world, that's why your genealogies all connect back through the coat of arms, right? So that
Mhm. Yeah,
they follow that line of hierarchy.
yeah. That makes so much sense. So I'll ask you this to sort of as we come to a close. In terms of, we started talking about at the very start the Phobotron, the monsters, the Chimera, and I'd addressed the likes of Lilith
Yep.
and the connection to vampirism and all of that. And I
Yep.
know vampirism is intrinsically still kind of a thing within Satanism.
Yeah.
And you'd mentioned that there's a connection with them all at this sort of time. So, in terms of, so I don't know about you, but I would see the likes of the vampire story being the likes of what we would address as a succubus, that idea of a spirit that drains. Um, or do you see them as literal Phobotron, as literal monsters, or they're spiritual influences anyway, demonic influences anyway, but are they literal?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's hard to get in behind the layers of occult literature and
Yeah.
mythos, right? But when I boil things back, is what is done on the earth is the same thing that's done in their heaven.
Yes. Yeah.
One in a physical way, one in a spiritual way.
Hmm.
And I think we get that sort of described in a matriarchal and a patriarchal bloodline and allegory of the dragon and the fairy. And so, if we look at the dragon with Dracula and drinking of the blood to keep
Hmm.
immortality, because the life is in the blood, that's kind of like a Nephilim sort of allegory, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the same thing. And it was really interesting on the Highlander series with the quickening and the taking of the head. That's the
Yeah.
fairy allegory of the quickening and the bringing in of the spirit. So I think what we're seeing is physical with the male and spiritual with the gods through the matriarchy, and of course that's at the top of the pantheon in their super secret worship. That there may be beings that would go, and I don't know how it happens that they gain the rights or permission to take their spirit,
Mm.
but they consume it, is what they're really
Right.
telling us. And what the other allegory through the vampire is telling us that in the physical world, they believe because life was in the blood, if you drank enough blood, you could get to be live longer. You can't live forever, but you can live longer because their life was limited to 120 years in Genesis 6:3. But they're trying to recreate on earth what's done in heaven. And for some reason, all of the gods in the original um, pantheon before the flood, and we see reflections after the flood, demanded human sacrifice, just
Yeah.
as the demigods did the same thing to eat the people and to drink their blood. So they're emulating the gods. But why did the gods want to have that blood sort of sacrifice? Well, it's kind of like in that quickening where they absorbed that power of that spirit into them that made them more powerful, is how we're sort of led to believe. So now when we look at how the demons would sort of do that, they would collect together to be like legion.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
emulating that same sort of aspect, but there has to be something, at least within their belief system, that suggests that the gods needed to collect as many people worshiping them and rights to their spirits
Mm.
that made them more powerful, or perhaps permitted them to continue to do what they're doing outside the laws of what God would have wanted them to do, or but he still permits them because he's letting it play out. But it has to do with their rebellion and what they need to do to maintain their power.
See, that's really interesting. When we've, as a team, went down and done research around megalithic structures, and one of the ones that we went into before was Fornox, and then we went into Onnagat, the Cave of Hell, or the Gates of Hell. But you can't just walk in. They all have like a capstone, which
Yeah,
is a sign of submission. Yeah, they have their incantation upon that, but you have to lie down to get in, like shakar in Hebrew, prostrate yourself as a
yeah,
form of worship. And it sort of dawned on me that's what that was when we were researching all this. So all of that, I want to ask you probably one final question because I know you've got a cold and don't want to take up all of your time. But are there, let's say, are there Nephilim or Nephilim hybrids today?
yeah. It's a really, really good question. So I think I certainly leave open the possibility that there are, whether or
Mhm.
not they're living in the earth,
Yeah.
whether or not they have ability to go back between portals or not. We had this instance with Steve Quayle as he was talking about it on Coast to Coast a number of years ago, and I listened to it after I had published book one, and I was said got to listen to this. And the pilot who was also on the show was the one who was the witness. And he was the pilot in Afghanistan where they had captured this red-headed um, giant.
Is that the Kandahar or
The
is it?
Kandahar giant,
Yeah,
and I was absolutely astonished at the accuracy of his descriptions, not only militarily wise, but from the giant aspect that at that time, before I started talking about a lot of it, people didn't recognize the size and the stoutness and the
yeah,
smell and the agility factor and how hard it was to kill and how heavy it was. Um, and so I, that alone, I mean, I don't know whether that is just because he had access to the information to be able to describe it or not,
mhm,
or actually real, but there's too much information there to dismiss that is accurate.
yeah,
So I think there's a possibility there's some. And if it's going to be like the days of Noah, somehow, some way, whether through stasis, whether through another incursion, whether or not through descendants of the giants or parts of all of the above, they are going to have an impact in the end time, and certainly the disembodied spirits will continue
yeah,
to interact, and once that pit prison opens they'll interact again and will somehow have oikotarians or dwelling places for the spirit provided for them so that they can interact physically like Gog obviously will, either through possession or through a cloned or transhuman or a combination oikotarian for that dwelling place. So I think we should be very much open to the idea as what Luke is telling us about how the fear is going to overtake us in terms of what
yeah.
we're seeing. We can't imagine what we're going to be seeing. That's the thing,
Mhm.
unless we look into prehistory.
So I'll tell you this just before we finish. My wife and I we're sort of very, very, very slowly making a documentary. Um, we were filming at a Mithraic temple at Hadrian's Wall. So we were in England and we were filming there, and she was operating the sound, and I'm on camera speaking away, giving a historical background and tying it together. And I had to run to her because she just said she felt this sort of wave of whatever, but it knocked her. Like her legs went. She just felt she couldn't stand. She wasn't right for some time afterwards. So these areas, these places, I guess you know what? I'll fit in one more question. I'll be cheeky.
Yeah.
Would they be spiritually charged?
Well, I think so. I mean, all of their temples are located on ancient holy sites. So if you have a Mithraic temple set up at Hadrian's Wall by the Romans,
Yeah,
they would have had knowledge from the locals or whomever that that would be a holy site.
yeah,
Just as you had the Gothic cathedrals all set up on ancient holy sites of polytheist locations. That's just what they do. So and that they also believe that those locations, whether it's ley lines or some other technology, had the ability to provide power of some sort, energy, whatever you want that to be, or could be a location as a portal for demons or fallen angels to come through. So they did it. That they did it to Mithra there for a reason,
yeah,
and it wasn't by, oh, we just want to set up a temple. I mean, you create this great wall
yeah.
and then you put a temple there where it's just going to be a site for war
Hmm.
by implication. Why would you do a temple there? Because it would provide them their gods fighting with them or some power
Yeah,
or something to that sort of effect. And you'd get that down in different pablums that the foot soldiers would be told, well, your gods will be with you this day. But
yeah, yeah,
the reason for it may be more in the interest of the bloodlines of the generals and what they're getting out of that. And they're just actually participating in another blood sacrifice for their gods every time they do a war there. I mean, who knows to the depravity of what that gets to because it's sort of open ended.
yeah. So, guys, I think if I sum up some things here, We're in a spiritual battle. And as you have heard Gary speak here, there's a plethora of information. There's a limitless bucket of information that you need to actually know, need to glean from to be aware of the time, season, and setting that you're in. So I
Yep.
want you to just say a big thank you to Gary. Please do me the favor of liking, sharing, of commenting. Please share this around your social media, and it makes you a media missionary. It allows the word to get out.
Yep.
So a big thank you, Gary, for coming on again.
Sure.
Do you have any last words?
Yeah, I want to leave somebody because we've been talking about, the possibility of giants somehow affecting us in the end time.
Mhm.
In the United States, they have something called FOIA requests for classified information when it
Okay.
can. So this FOIA is F-2019-02110, and it was made by somebody named Dinetra de Senegar, who worked for, at that time, Hillary Clinton,
Right. Okay.
who was the Secretary of State during the time part of the Iraq wars. And so she's requesting documents pertaining to the Chamber of Gilgamesh,
Right.
the location of his body, and the location of the buried Nephilim. And then there's a second sort of addendum on there from the Denetra, and it specifically says in her words, requesting documents pertaining to the resurrection chamber of Gilgamesh, the location of his body, and the location of the buried Nephilim. So again, exact words as they're being posted. So we know they discovered something.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton wants to know about it, and they're interested in two things: the chamber and the body. So they're looking for two things from this
Mhm.
giant who, if people
Yeah.
don't know how big this giant was, and he was the offspring of King Lugobando, the father of Uruk, fifth generation after the flood, Gilgamesh's sixth generation, and the bull goddess Nin, to create this dark-haired giant like
Mhm.
Nimrod would look like. And he is described in not only the Ugaritic text, but in the Sumerian traditions as the same dimensions as 11 cubits tall, which is 19 feet tall by a king's cubit. And he is 4 cubits wide or 7 feet wide. I mean, this is a monster. So you're only going to want the body for DNA
Yeah.
and replication. And you only want the chamber if there's technology involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if that was the resurrection chamber, as they call it, what type of technology could be like a resurrection? So is it, and what we do know about in the Ugaritic text is that the Rapiu or the Raphaim, they were also understood as healers of themselves and for others. So when they lost that ability or weakened, did they need to have some sort of technology to repair themselves? What we do know is very difficult to kill a giant, as we talked about with the
Yeah.
Afghanistan giant. You literally have to take the head off quickly so it can't repair itself. But a resurrection chamber, I mean, I mean, I just, I mean, I wish I had more detail on it, but that's public knowledge.
That's literally a mic drop situation there. Just that's that's fascinating, and that actually explains as well why the decapitation of Goliath happened. You have
Yeah,
to get rid of the head.
yeah, yeah, because that rock would have killed him. So why take the head off? Right?
Yeah.
Here's so people know, I printed off so you can't see it, but I got it on two sides. But you can ask for that and just go into it at that. It's F-2019-02110 for FOIA, and you should be able to run a copy of it because that's what I did. You can't get more because now you got to go through the whole process, right? So,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, so another interesting story that's rather interesting that sort of biblically ties that in. And in book two, I cover off other places where they take the heads of giants, right?
Yeah.
So, In the time of Jesus, and after his baptizing by John, and John is put into prison, and Herod eventually, for his daughter, is going to have the head taken off of John, right?
Mm.
And people say, okay, that's interesting. But then you read on that all of a sudden Herod hears of somebody in Galilee area doing all of these miracles. And he is absolutely beside himself
Hmm.
because he thinks it's John. And why he is absolutely terrified is because he should be dead because he took his head off.
Yeah.
But yet he thinks John is in Galilee. And unless you know the connection between taking the head, and he ensured the head was taken off and the daughter was, so that they couldn't come back because he thought
Hmm.
he might be of royal blood, and might have the ability to survive, right? So all of a sudden, details start to make sense when you
Yeah.
understand what's going on. I mean, to have David take him down and then take Goliath's sword to cut his head off, um, is an extraordinary story.
Hmm.
And that if he had to ensure the head was going to be cut off, he would have had his own sword, you would think. But that's what
Yeah.
really makes the story huge is he takes them down, kills them, but to make sure he's going to make sure he's sent to probably the pit prison,
Yeah.
using Goliath's own sword. And then he takes that head over to Jerusalem immediately thereafter. And he's telling them that he is going to be the one who's going to take Jerusalem. He does it a few years later, but not again. The
Yeah.
details are just so extraordinary. And then that's the hill on Golgotha Hill that
Hmm.
Jesus is crucified on.
It shows you that the Bible, for one, is not of human intellect. It's
Yeah.
just too many woven patterns that I don't even think AI could come up with. You know?
No, it just goes in so many different directions, and but the connections are there. But yes, I think it definitely testifies to the preternatural nature of Scripture.
Yeah. And also, you have reminded me that Highlander's forever ruined for me, even though they're bringing out a new one, and it's I'm not going to be able to watch it the same way anymore.
Yeah, I'll watch it too, but like most entertainment now, I sort of look at what story they're really telling us in that
Yeah,
literature.
yeah.
So, yeah,
What's the narrative behind it? And
yeah.
listen, I want to thank you again. I know that you are very busy and you've got like load of interviews and so on. Um, just one more time, where can everybody get the book, the new one?
The new one, yes, it's available on Amazon, and it will be in probably Amazon around the world, but Barnes and Noble and most online bookstores. It will be available soon. It's available for pre-order there now. The Audible version will come out probably close to the time of the release date for April 1, and the digital one should be out about the same time as well. Again, all through Amazon for both Audible and Kindle. And if you wanted to pre-order through me and get a signed copy, you can go to my website. It's up there, and there's a little bit of write-up that I have up there. I'm trying to figure out what else I'm going to put up there for the to advertise it. And so where you pre-order is you go to the, buy now. There's 5 pages up there. So buy page one is for book one with discounts. Buy page two is for book two with volume discounts as well. And then buy page three is for the Aprimo conspiracy. Again, for multiple copies, there's discounts. Buy page four is the bundling page for book one and two together. And by
Hmm.
page three is the bundling for books one, two, and the Oprimos conspiracy together. And I've put that all together because I'm thinking that for people who aren't familiar with my research, when they start to read about who the characters are, the organizations they belong to, the bloodlines, the eschatology, the locations, they're going to want to learn more about my research because most of that comes out of my books.
Fantastic. So I'll have all the links in the description, guys. And again, just a big thank you to Gary for coming on today. And I'm sure we'll have him on again. Guys, God bless. I call you the head and not the tail, above and not beneath, kings, queens, and priests in Jesus' mighty name. And remember, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you.